Hello there. Welcome to the GWCT DEFRA training webinar. So I'm just going to bring this up on the full screen. Fantastic. Yes, welcome to the introduction to UK agriculture. So this is the recorded version of the webinar, which we've delivered to some of you there at DEFRA over the previous months. So it's about 90 minutes long. Unfortunately, of course, there's no chance for questions in the recorded version, but hopefully it will be of interest. So I'll get into it now and yeah, last about 90 minutes. So just to introduce myself and the Allerton project, the GWCT Allerton project, where hopefully I will have seen or will see many of you in the coming weeks and months, is a research and educational trust. We're a working conventional farm on the Leicestershire-Rutland border, just near Uppingham, and we actually combine that practical modern farming element with being a research and demonstration farm. So we have a full-time team of research scientists on the farm who actually go out and do an awful lot of research into essentially more sustainable farming and landscape management solutions, and have been doing for 30 years. So it's quite a unique place in as much as it marries up that, being a livestock and arable farm, like really any other lowland livestock and arable farm, while at the same time having that research and educational element to it. I have a background in farming, so I was on my family farm in northwest Leicestershire farming for about 12 years full-time before I went to the Allerton project in the summer of 2021. So my background is in dairy, beef, arable and some sheep. I also sit on the National Farmers Union's Environment Forum, so that's essentially trying to drive greater uptake of sustainable agricultural practices into both NFU and then national government policy, and this is something that I'm really passionate about bringing to the public as well. So I also sort of write on this sort of stuff quite widely. So we'll make a start. Where do we start? Why did we have empty shelves recently? In recent years, recent months, recent years, why have we had empty shelves? Why have we had rationing of staple food products in the UK? Why have we got sort of really high food inflation in the first half of 2023 in the UK? Well, it's frankly, it's incredibly complicated. There have been so many different things which have fed into the fact that, frankly, food and farming hasn't been out of the headlines for the past 6 or 7 years, really since the Brexit vote. We've had everything from Brexit to COVID, obviously. We have climate change. We have the war in Ukraine. We have, other zoonotic diseases, for example, such as bird flu. Of course, many will remember the foot and mouth outbreak of the early 2000s. Of course, our food system, in large part, sits at the end of long, complex global supply chains. So, one boat getting stuck in the Suez Canal leads to the breakdown of global supply chains, including in food. So there are many factors as to why that frankly feed into our food supply chain here in the UK. It's an incredibly complex, often just-in-time system. Of course, one of the very significant issues within the UK market is the monopoly power as well of the retailers. There are 5 big supermarkets which control 90+% of the food supply in the UK. And this has a very distorting effect on that food market. There are various concerns which are currently being addressed by government. We're now in sort of mid-2023 around that monopolistic power of those major retailers. And of course, the incredibly unequal relationship between those large retailers and farmers and producers of food especially, and where the profits go in that food chain. Of course, UK consumers as well are statistically far more driven by price when it comes to in-home eating, UK consumers are far more concerned around price, and that usually means securing the cheapest than any other consumers in the UK. So again, in the UK, that is a particular concern. That food has to be getting increasingly cheaper all the time. So of course, when food price inflation actually starts to step in, that comes as a real shock to the system. So all of these factors, Brexit, COVID, climate change is having an increasing impact on our food supply chains. The war in Ukraine, long and extended supply chains, monopolistic powers of the retailers. These are all feeding into why we have an incredibly turbulent situation in our food chain here in the UK at the moment. So sustainability in food systems, this is something that I'm incredibly, passionate about. But I think one of the areas where perhaps there's a misapprehension around this argument, around this conversation, is that sustainability is solely talking about the environment. When we're talking about food sustainability, it seems to get boiled down consistently in our national conversation, and often in policy conversations as well, as to what is the best for the environment. Now, of course, we can't just focus food and land use policy on what would be the best for either climate or biodiversity, because we have to balance that against all manner of different land uses, including, of course, food production. So food production and profitable food production has to be a part of that sustainable triangle. Otherwise, of course, the big danger is that we simply offsource our food requirements abroad, just as we've offsourced many of our manufacturing requirements abroad, where we have no subsequent control over the environmental, welfare, climate standards that food is produced from. So yes, we have to be very mindful of our environmental standards and what we're doing here in the UK, but we have to also be squaring that with food production. And those two things do not have to be polar opposites. We can have both of those things together. When we're talking about the social element of this triangle, British farmers, we have a social license to, we manage 70% of the land area of the UK, and there's very few of us statistically. So farmers need to have that social license. We need to be able to explain why what we do, how do we do it, and why should people care? Why should people support that British food production? And we have to take people along with us on that journey, because of course, again, the danger is otherwise people will simply look for the cheapest food. And of course, that cheap food generally is paid for indirectly somewhere else, usually by the environment. So the challenge now, the figures you're looking at here, they're kind of crude global figures, which can be misleading, but they sort of tell a bit of a story here. Globally, agriculture is generally considered to be responsible for around 25% of greenhouse gas emissions. Around 50% of global land use, 70% of global freshwater use, and most of global water pollution from things like nitrates and phosphates and plant protection products. So agriculture has a huge impact globally on our natural environment. And the climate. So the challenges that we're currently facing, in this country as farmers, within the food chain are, climate change, biodiversity loss, soil degradation and loss, air and water pollution, resource depletion, regulatory change, the sorts of things that we're seeing from your department, societal expectations. People want more sustainable food, but they're not necessarily willing to pay for that. Essentially, what we are looking at is needing to produce, I believe the figure is between 2020 and 2050, globally, we need to produce more food than has been produced in all of human history up to 2020. But of course, we have to do that in a far more sustainable fashion than has been done up to this point. We have to do more with less. This is the big challenge. The next 30 years, we have to feed that growing global population, but we've got to do it a lot more sustainably than we've done up to this point. And that's a really exciting challenge, but it is a challenge. And there's a lot of things that have got to, they've got to slot into place in order for us to be successful in that. So just some basic statistics for a start around the environmental impact of agriculture here in the UK. agriculture is responsible for around 10% of national emissions here in the UK. You can hear some crazy figures. I often ask this question of groups who come to the Allerton project, and you can often hear, up to 60% as a guess as to what that figure is, but it's actually around 10% of emissions in the UK economy are from agriculture. As you can see in the bottom right, that number has dropped over time as a sort of a gross figure. Agriculture's environmental emissions have dropped over, since the 1990s, but only by around 15%. So there is significant additional gains, I believe, that can be made in that regard. Essentially, over the last 30 years, farmers have not really been focusing on sort of reducing especially their climate impact. It's not really been on the agenda. It's not something that society has been asking of us, but it has been slowly decreasing in that time anyway. So it's quite exciting to think what can be achieved if we really put our minds to it as an industry and have the support to do that. As you can see on the top left-hand side, the significant contribution that agriculture makes to the greenhouse gas makeup in the UK is methane and nitrous oxide. So we're actually, we don't produce very much CO2 at all as an industry, but and that mostly comes from, combustion of fuel within tractors and that sort of thing. But it's methane and nitrous oxide, primarily from livestock and from soil emissions. That is where we are seeing the major impact from agriculture. And as you can see, those two gases are significantly more warming than carbon dioxide. So that is something that we do have to address as an industry. So the next thing that we really have to think about is the variety. There is a huge amount of variety within UK agriculture, and of course, if we're just talking about England here within this webinar, for the most part, even within England, there is absolutely massive variety. We do everything in this country from upland extensive livestock grazing to lowland intensive arable and horticultural production to biomass production, livestock production of all kinds, renewable energy. Even if we just look at things like dairy production, for example, as we'll come to in later webinars, there is huge variety of systems just within that one sector. Everything from low intensity calf at foot dairies at one end of the spectrum to 365 days per year indoor house intensively fed at the other end of the spectrum. So when we're talking about UK agriculture, it is an incredibly broad and complex picture to take in. And within then just the food production element, of course, we then have the environmental element. We then have, of course, diversifications, as you can see, for example, in that bottom picture there, somebody there planting a large amount of Christmas trees, agritourism and all the rest of it. So there is a huge element of variety within the industry. But of course, those different parts of the industry are all also inextricably linked. The livestock linked to the arable sector, because the arable sector provides not just the food, but also the bedding for much of that livestock sector. And of course, the livestock sector providing a large part of the market and vice versa. So there is an awful lot of complementarity and integration within the UK agricultural sector as well. And of course, that has grown up over many years. But of course, this is also one of the challenges of producing ELM, of producing a post-Brexit agricultural policy, that it is an incredibly complex area to try and legislate for. And of course, then that's different across the 4 nations of the UK. So if we look at agricultural land use, around, as I've already mentioned, I think around 70% of the UK's land area is managed by farmers. We actually produce around about 75% of indigenous food, i.e. food types that we can produce here in the UK with our climate, but only around 60% of all food consumed in the UK is actually produced here. So we import around about 40% of the food that we produce here in the UK, although that figure is dropping. As you can see, things like milk, lamb, wheat, beef, we're largely self-sufficient in, but things like pork, vegetables, and especially fruit, we import huge amounts of every single year. Those figures are in red because actually that figure is continually dropping, as a result of various factors over the past couple of years. Our production of pork, vegetables, fruit are dropping quite rapidly. So we're becoming more reliant on imports in those sectors. About 2/3 of UK farmland is actually grazed, so it is grassland, most of that permanent grassland. And that's actually land that really couldn't be put to any other use. Either the soils are too thin or too infertile, or the slopes are too steep or too rocky. Frankly, 2/3 of UK agricultural land is grassland. And that is why, the UK is very significantly a livestock producing country. That is what we excel in. So that is an absolutely core part of the UK's agricultural sector. But as you can see, if we get outside of grassland in the graph on the right, then cereal crops are our next biggest sector. And then you get down to things like horticulture, vegetable production. Actually, that's a very small part of our land use here in the UK. We're actually around 40%, only 40. If we return to fruit for a second, we're only about 40% self-sufficient, even in indigenous fruit stuff. So things like apples and pears. So you'll be very familiar going to supermarkets and seeing, fruit, even those sorts of things which are almost quintessentially British, being imported from all parts of the world. So especially that fruit sector is particularly under pressure at the moment. And we've seen a 20% contraction in the production of things like pork, things like horticultural products in the UK since 2021. That is sort of a very rapidly evolving situation right now. So broadly speaking, what do we grow and where in the UK? And as you can see, again, very broadly speaking, in the east we grow arable, in the west we have livestock, and in the middle of the country, we have mixed farming, so a mixture of both of those two things. Why is that? Well, as you can see from the left-hand side, to the west of the country and up in Scotland, it is steep and it is wet. So those parts of the country are predominantly suited to the growth of grass. So that is where the majority of our livestock sits. A lot of those soils aren't particularly productive either, especially if you go to the uplands. And, the agricultural sector over centuries has developed into making use of that relatively low-grade agricultural land. In the east, we have some very much more fertile soils, and we have less rain. Now, rain, of course, is absolutely vital for growing crops, but too much rain, especially around the summer, can be a significant problem. So in the east, we generally have the right amount of rainfall on good, flat, open soils in order to produce those crops. And in the west, we generally have that high rainfall, which is great for growing grass. It's less, vital that you get those long periods of good weather if you're not growing the crops. So that's broadly speaking what we're talking about here. When you're looking at that little bit about market gardening down in the southwest, that's because the southwest, frankly, it's incredibly remote geographically. So they have almost over time become historically quite self-sufficient. They do a bit of everything down there because they are so cut off almost from the rest of the UK. So land classification, just briefly. The land classification system, which is still in use today, it originated in the 1960s, and it basically grades all of the land in the UK, all of the natural land in the UK, based on essentially the agricultural productivity of the soils. So it will look at factors such as climate, such as gradient, and then the soil quality itself. Now, of course, what we're considering today, or perhaps we should be considering today, is that a suitable metric by which to grade land in the 2020s? Should we be bringing in things like biodiversity value, for example, into that metric? But when we're talking about land classification, if you hear grade 1, grade 2 land, that is at the top end of the spectrum. That's a really productive land. Grade 1 land, we're talking about sort of the peatlands, the drained peatlands of the fens, for example, where they're growing a huge amount of our sort of horticultural produce and higher value fresh goods. And then if we're starting to talk about sort of grade 5, that sort of upland rough grazing with a very low agricultural productivity. So that's what we're talking about when we do mention land classification. And then sort of broadly speaking, this is what we're looking at here. So again, those high quality blue soils, sort of around the Wash, East Anglia, the Fens, Somerset Levels, those sorts of areas. And then, yes, those upland areas, grade 4, grade 5, where agricultural production is very much more extensive. And margins are generally speaking much tighter, and we're talking about sort of upland livestock grazing in those areas. In the middle, of course, grade 3 land. The vast majority of agricultural land is grade 3. That's what I'm used to farming through my farming career, and that is sort of just sort of moderately productive. Can be grass, can be arable in many cases, sort of soils. So then if we're looking at farmland values, so this is a graph of farm land values since the mid-90s, and you can see the absolutely exponential increase in those values in that time. So we're going from an average of around about £1,000 an acre to, well, as you can see in 2022, bare agricultural land reached record highs, arable up to £10,500 an acre and pasture up to £8,500 an acre, each of those respectively up 12 and 13% on the year before. And as you can see, different land types do have varying values, which have become accentuated over time. So, that poor upland grazed livestock ground is worth a lot less than prime grade 1 arable land. But as you can also see, there was a huge spike in land values around 2007. And of course, that was to coincide with the financial crisis. As people piled out of financial derivatives as investment vehicles, they actually piled money into land, which has, of course, always been seen as a very safe, if relatively low yielding investment. But of course, since that time, you've seen that land driven by that investment has massively increased in value. So that money which came out of financial investments sort of in the middle of the 2000s has really stayed in land, and land has then become a hugely profitable investment vehicle. Now, of course, this has implications and problems for the traditional buyers and traders of agricultural land, which is, farmers. The average turnover of agricultural land is once every 200 years. But today, for the first time, less than 50% of agricultural land buyers are actually farmers, active farmers. And that majority now is made up of lifestyle buyers, people wanting to buy estates in the country, investors who are wanting to use it as an investment vehicle, environmental groups who are wanting to buy it up for projects like rewilding, and of course companies who are wanting to buy up agricultural land in order to reach their own environmental and net zero targets. So all of those people are piling into the land market, with the resulting inflation that you're seeing in this graph, and the distortion of agricultural markets. Now this this process, this is now at the sort of regional level. So as you can see, land values in Scotland, where generally speaking they have lower, generally lower quality of agricultural land, have always lagged behind the higher productivity areas, especially in England. But as you can also see, Scottish land values have absolutely accelerated hugely in the last couple of years. That being in very large part driven by estates coming up, which are being snapped up by institutional investors who are for the large part utilizing them for things like carbon offsetting schemes. And that is having a massive inflationary impact on Scottish, especially, but also Welsh agricultural land at the moment. So that's what's happening within the agricultural land values at the moment, and there's no sign of them cooling down. So just some broad agricultural facts and figures. So a lot of this data is actually taken from DEFRA's own publications. So but I'm very well aware that some of this data will be very familiar to some of you, I'm sure. Others less so. And of course, until it's actually put together in one easily accessible place, then often these things don't really come to your attention. But there's actually around about 218,000 farm businesses in the UK, or there was in 2021, which is actually now starting to feel like quite a long time ago. The average farm size is around 80 hectares, but it has to be borne in mind that 50% of farms are less than 20 hectares. Now, a hectare is about the size of a rugby pitch. My family farm, which I grew up on, was around 320 hectares, which is kind of considered to be an average kind of normal farm size. So that 80 hectare size is quite badly skewed by that very significant number of farms which are less than 20 hectares. And of course, many of them will in reality just be small holdings. They'll be hobby farms. There'll be a few horse paddocks, so they're not, that farm, that 218 farm business figure it has to be treated with a certain note of caution. Just as a comparison, the National Farmers Union has around about 50,000 members of that organization, which I think are considered to sort of constitute 2/3, 3/4 of the farmed land in England and Wales, certainly. So that perhaps puts a bit of perspective on these figures. Agriculture accounts for around about 0.5% of UK GDP, of which the vast majority is generated in England. But of course, those figures are also very variable across the nations of the UK. So Wales, for example, 22% of Welsh GDP is generated from agriculture. So, England, actually, we have the smallest percentage of GDP, which contributes to English GDP, but we actually provide by far the vast majority of UK GDP when it comes to agriculture, but only 0.5% directly contributed by ag. Agriculture, 15% of registered businesses and 8% of employment in rural areas come from agriculture directly. But if you look at the uplands, that then rises to 30 and 14% respectively. So especially when we've been hearing recently concerns around how Elm and the post-Brexit landscape will work for upland farmers, you can see the very significant impact that it could have if this isn't made to work in those upland areas, especially when we start to talk about things like levelling up, etc. Nationally, less than 500,000 people, which is only around 1.5% of the workforce, is now directly sort of employed in agriculture, which is, of course, a tiny fraction of where we would have been 100, 200 years ago. And 2/3 of them, near enough, are family members. So family farming is still by far, the bedrock of agriculture in this country, and only around 38% are, employees. But again, big variations between the different nations. It's 1.2% of the workforce in England, and it's 6% of the workforce in Northern Ireland. Demographically, more than 35% of farm holders, i.e. those in management control of the farm, are over the age of 65. Less than 15% of those farm holders are under the age of 45. So there are very few younger farmers. I think a young farmer is actually considered anyone below 40 within the industry, which is scary. So I'd still just qualify. But 85% of those people in those management positions are also male. And again, it won't come as any surprise to know that almost entirely also white. So older white men make up by far the largest management element of the agricultural sector, which is one of those issues that as a sector we do probably have to be doing more to address. We have lost 9,000 farm businesses since 2019. So that is a continuing trend. The number of farm businesses is declining. We've lost around 5% of dairy farms alone in the last 12 months. And again, we're now in sort of mid-2023. So this is a continuing trend that we are seeing a continual consolidation of the UK agricultural sector, bigger farms, etc. So again, I'm not sure that is necessarily something which is being in any way encouraged officially, by government policy, or something that the public wants to see, but that is what is currently happening. But of course, agriculture is the bedrock. Yes, we generate around £11 billion for the economy, but we're also the bedrock of 120, 130 billion pound UK food and farming sector. We sit at the very bottom, providing the foodstuffs for that food sector. So we are the bedrock of the UK's largest manufacturing sector. So if we just cover the tenanted sector a bit, I've been asked specifically to cover this off because it is such an important element of UK agriculture. And of course, there's been the ROC review recently, which has looked into this for DEFRA. More than 30% of English farmed land is tenanted. And 65, so and nearly 2/3 of agricultural holdings, so agricultural businesses in England, are at least partly tenanted. So the tenanted sector is absolutely vital, central, huge for UK agriculture, for English agriculture. So about half of tenanted land is on short to medium term farm business tenancy, so short rents. And around another half is on longer term, what are called Agricultural Holding Act tenancies or full agricultural tenancies, which we'll come to in a second. Around half of English farms are owner occupied. Around a third of English farms are a mixture of owner occupied and rented, which was my case back on my family farm, and around 15% are purely tenanted. And the average farm tenancy length in England is 3 years. And these figures are all from the recent ROC review. So that is incredibly short. Just a really basic arable rotation is 3 years. One rotation. It would take 3 years to get livestock from birth to killing in many cases. So that is an incredibly short period of time. And if we're looking at tenant farmers, the average tenant farm's income from BPS before BPS reductions kicked in at the start of the agricultural transition period was around 75%. So 62% of the average English farm's income in 2020 came from the single farm payment, but that goes up to 75% for tenant farmers. They were disproportionately reliant on that single farm payment. And tenanted farms also have the lowest income of all farm business types. So tenant farms have some particular challenges, and we'll come on to those shortly. So the difference between an AHA tenancy and an FBT tenancy, essentially an AHA tenancy gives you lifetime security of tenure. So they are very long-term tenancies. They can even be 3-generational tenancies. So from father to son or daughter to grandson or daughter. So that gives you a long-term security, long-term tenure on the land, which gives you the ability to invest and the security to invest. And generally speaking, rents are also lower. Now, those FBTs, AHAs, they actually came in the wake of the Second World War when there was a real shortage of farmers, and landowners were looking to incentivize farmers to come back onto the land, to farm the land for them. Now, as the years have gone on and competition for farmland has massively increased, many landowners sort of are not happy at being locked into those long-term multi-generational tenancies anymore, which could still have potentially, another generation on them to this point. So there's been this rise in the farm business tenancy, which, as we've already noted, 3 years is the average length of those. So realistically, 8-10 years is the shortest sort of tenancy you might want on a farm to have some level of security and to be able to invest for the long term. So 3 years is incredibly short, and FBTs can be as short as 1 year rolling contracts, which gives again the tenant absolutely zero security or confidence in the future. And generally as well, those FBTs, not only are they shorter term, but they're also higher rent as well, which is reflected on this graph. So as you can see, the FATs are lower rents than those FBTs above them. So the unique challenges of the tenanted sector. So again, huge part of the farmed area of the UK is tenanted. That length of tenure is a massive issue on those shorter term tenancies. Access to finance. So especially for pure tenant farmers who don't own any land at all, from which that they can use as leverage to get credit. Tenant farmers can really struggle to access finance, especially when agricultural volatility is so high, when agricultural profitability is so low. Lending to a farmer that doesn't have any leverage, anything to leverage against other than perhaps their own livestock, can be an incredibly difficult process to go through. Rental values versus productive capacity. Yeah, I mean, as a tenant farmer myself for many years, I was told many times by land agents who generally act on behalf of landlords that the rental value of the land was no longer linked to its productive capacity, i.e., we are going to charge you more rent than you can make farming this land because the land value is so high. Now, of course, that doesn't make any actual sense to say we're going to charge you a lot of rent because because we could sell this land for a lot of money. Well, that's of no interest to me. I'm just trying to make a living from farming the land. But that is the way that the land rental value has become disconnected from the productive capacity of the land in many cases in the last 10 to 15 years. So that is a real problem. Again, that's having a hugely distorting impact on farm rents, but also on the general rural economy. Landlord relationships. Some landlords have fantastic relationships with tenants. Other landlords have very poor relationships with tenants. And one of the big dangers is landlords who basically look at their estates and their tenants with an exploitative tendency. Who are not willing to help the tenant invest. And who are in fact looking to maximize revenue from that tenant, and especially if they're willing to chop and change tenants just for whoever's going to give them the most money in the short term. Now, of course, that's incredibly bad for the long-term health of the land or of the buildings and the infrastructure. But unfortunately, that's the way that many tenants are treated by landlords. Now, that's not universal, but that is often the case. So there is a real problem and a real imbalance of power between landlords and tenants. And there's really many tenants feel that there's absolutely nothing they can do to push back against their landlord because, of course, they have no security of tenure. So they could be kicked off within 6 to 12 months if they do anything which they feel might be to offend the landlord. So that is a real problem within the tenanted sector, which is something which the Rock Review has tried to look at. And again, those less good landlords will potentially block you from diversifying your farm business. Or even from accessing agri-environment schemes. And again, that is something which is far from uncommon, or has been far from uncommon, unfortunately. And then, of course, tenants are always going to be more, tenants on farm business tenancy certainly are going to struggle to invest in things like agroforestry, forestry, because they're such long-term propositions that if you've only got a 3, 4, 5-year tenancy, then planting trees makes really very little sense for you as a tenant. Even though people on those long-term AHA tenancies, says change of use down there, landlords can take back those tenancies if they put those estates over to a change of use and non-agricultural use. And again, this is one of the potential dangers around, for example, landscape scale rewilding projects, for example, tree planting projects, that you could see whole farms taken even out of relatively stable tenures and given that change of use certification, which means they can just be taken out of food production entirely. And succession, there is just a general huge problem around bringing the next generation on into agriculture. There can be some very toxic on-farm relationships between family members or farms who don't then necessarily have a successor. So succession can be a significant issue. And I think bad succession situations within families is actually the single leading reason for the death of family farms statistically, when parents fall out with children and vice versa, and there is nobody to take the farm on. So that is a significant problem within agriculture as well. So just talking about new entrants. Oh, and just as we talk about new entrants, the tenanted sector has always been a route to allow fresh blood to come into the industry. To allow new people, new ideas to come into the industry. And as we'll just cover now, some of the problems we've already covered around the tenanted sector, especially the financial issues. But there is a real problem at the moment with new entrants into agriculture. So county council farms, for those who aren't lucky enough to be born into a family farming situation, which they can make work, county council farms have traditionally been a route into the agricultural sector. But as you can see, the acreage of those county council farms, which are traditionally let out to young new entrants into the industry, has halved in the last 40 years, as those areas of land have been sold off to balance budgets, or perhaps now increasingly again turned over to environmental projects in order to balance carbon budgets. What we're seeing on the right hand side is that essentially what young entrants lack is access to land and finance. They are the two major blocks. So if there's challenges for existing tenant farmers to access finance, there are much larger challenges to new entrants with no track record and no business, no existing business. There's huge problems there for those young entrants to get access to finance and land. With the values as they are at the moment, buying is of course out of the question, and even renting is pretty much out of the question also for many young entrants. So these are the two major barriers to access for those young entrants. So one of the things the Rock Review was very disappointed in when it came to sort of DEFRA's current position on new entrants was that there was really no help given on those two factors. The only thing that was currently available was around business advice, which is for the most part not what young entrants need, and it's not the blocking factor to get those new people into the industry. Also, the fact that the lump sum exit scheme wasn't linked to a new entrant scheme, which seemed like an obvious thing to do, again, in order to get new people onto the land. Now, of course, there are some opportunities. From the post-cap policy, this move towards more regenerative agriculture will encourage things such as flying flocks. So young people, potentially new entrants, buying livestock, which they then graze on other farmers' land. So they don't have to own land, they don't really have to rent land, they have their livestock on that land, usually for a pretty low sum of money, and they manage to generate their livestock as a business proposition, and the farmer gets sort of organic manures and the benefits of having the livestock on their land to regenerate soil and soil health. So that is the sort of thing where we're looking at sort of more opportunities now than there was 10 years ago, certainly. But there are also organizations like the Plum Foundation, of which I'm a trustee, helping to get young people into agriculture. Oxbury, a new agricultural startup bank, they have offers to help young entrants, with business advice and with good terms on loans as well to get them into the industry. So they're the sorts of things we are starting to see. But again, there are ever increasing barriers essentially to young people getting into the sector, unfortunately. And yeah, the headline recommendations from the Rock Review was around longer terms needed for tenancy agreements, making sure tenants can access public monies for public goods. Now, one of the problems here is, even though, yes, now there is no requirement for landlord's consent to get into an SFI scheme, for example, but if you haven't got your landlord's consent and they don't want you to go into SFI, and you do, and you're on a 12 or 24-month tenancy, then you're not going to be on that land in 12 or 24 months. So although there's no legal way they can stop you, that still exists as a problem, of course. And creating incentives for tenants and landlords to invest. Again, if landlords don't want to invest with their tenants, and tenants have no incentive to invest because they have no security of tenure, then that long term is a huge drag on rural productivity and on the health and well-being of our countryside. So the value of UK ag sectors 2021. So as you can see, livestock, by far the biggest of the two, livestock and crops. Livestock, we are predominantly a livestock producing country. And again, that's mostly down to our weather, our fantastic temperate marine climate, and the large amounts of grass that we can grow. So as you can see, within that, dairy is the biggest sector. Dairy and beef, the two biggest sectors. Poultry, just behind beef. Now that's kind of, poultry is on an incredibly small space, geographical spread. Poultry is generally concentrated in very small poultry units, poultry sheds, indoor housed sheds, but they have a very large output. And again, pigs, very few actual pigs in the UK, but they have a very large, financial turnover every year. So dairy, but especially beef and especially sheep, have a very, very large geographical footprint. Poultry, pigs, eggs have a very small footprint, but they have a relatively high output. And it's the same on the arable and the crop side. Cereals is by far our largest arable land use. Vegetables and flowers has comparatively an absolutely tiny element of the landscape, but they're very high value crops in comparison. So they sort of show up much larger in this value chart. I'm not going to labor this at all, but as you can see, cereals, 3.2 million, oilseeds, 352,000 hectares. And again, horticulture down there with only around 160,000 hectares. And yet, roughly comparable on value compared to those arable fields. But again, you can't grow horticultural produce in most of that arable land. It is generally concentrated in the higher value land, in the grade 1, grade 2 land. And, that's why that is the case. And again, you can see, very significant numbers of poultry and sheep especially. Now, some of the interesting points just to dig down into these, things like oilseed rape, that's actually dropped from 610,000 hectares back in 2018 to 307,000 in 2021. So these figures that you're looking at here are constantly changing. They're not, they're not rigid. We've got a hell of a lot more poultry now than we did 20 years ago, and we've got an awful lot less oilseed rape, which was a vital element of the arable rotation. But we have halved the amount of oilseed rape we grow in this country just in the last couple of years, and that's as a result of primarily the loss of the neonicotinoid seed dressing, which was sort of a vital product to protect it from an insect pest. Now there's really no protection from that insect pest, and unfortunately, our ability to grow that crop in the UK has now been fundamentally compromised, at least in the short to medium term, and that has had serious implications on sort of farm rotations, which are still being dealt with on an annual basis. It's also probably just important at this point just to mention things like carcass balance. So you'll remember at the start, we are 75% self-sufficient in beef, for example. Now, we'll never be fully self-sufficient in beef because, frankly, there's parts of the carcass which the UK consumer just never wants to eat. Generally, in the UK, we're talking about the lower value parts of the carcass, especially things like the offal, tongue, and that sort of thing, oxtail. British consumers don't really want to eat that. So we generally export that, and we then generally have to import other more high quality food, sort of parts of the carcass. We love a steak in this country. We're big for burgers. So minced, parts of the carcass that get minced and turn into those sorts of things. But, we do have to import higher value parts of the carcass. We do have to export lower value parts of the carcass. So that carcass balance issue is quite important when we're talking about, will we ever be self-sufficient in some things? Frankly, again, it's a very complex subject, which we don't unfortunately have time to get into today. Just one final thing, there's about 2,500 hectares of vineyards now in the UK. So around 550 vineyards, commercial vineyards, which aren't on these figures. But again, that's a rapidly growing, rapidly developing part of the UK agricultural sector, which, frankly, in part is also being driven by climate change. So broadly speaking, UK livestock numbers since 1990, as you can see, and as I mentioned a few minutes ago, poultry has had a massive increase in that period of time. As poultry has, as chicken has, chicken and eggs, but chicken has become the most popular meat eaten in this country and globally. I think it overtook red meat in this country about 5 or 6 years ago. But as you can see, also our pig numbers, our sheep numbers, and our dairy cattle numbers especially have dropped hugely, by about 30–40% since 1990. So actually we have historically quite low levels of livestock in this country, which again is something which is perhaps not always necessarily appreciated. But at the same time, the efficiency of those livestock, especially of, for example, our dairy herd, is always increasing. So we have about a third or 40% less dairy cows in the UK than we did 30 years ago, but we actually produce, I think, something like 20% more milk than we did 30 years ago, which is a remarkable achievement. So our food production to supply ratio. So this is again just sort of demonstrating our levels of self-sufficiency over the last couple of hundred years. So the last time we were actually self-sufficient in food was probably towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and since then, our fortunes in this regard have gone up and down. We've reached historic lows around the time of the First and Second World Wars. And then after the Second World War, we managed to gradually increase our food security until a high point, a recent historical high point of the late 1980s, when we were around about 80–85% self-sufficient in food in this country. And then it has tailed off steadily ever since. We now sit around about 55–60% self-sufficiency. Now, of course, we will never be entirely self-sufficient in food in this country again, and nor should we want to be. There has to be an element of imports and exports in order to, act as a stabilizer against domestic volatility in food production. And of course, people's diets are very, very different to what they were 30 and 40 and 50 years ago. People want, things out of season. They want things that are exotic that we cannot produce in this country. But there is this whole question around how much lower do we want that core food security figure to drop in an increasingly climatically unstable, geopolitically unstable world. And that is a real hot topic, I think, within the industry, certainly. So just a brief thing on native breeds. So yeah, our livestock numbers have dropped significantly in the last 30 years. But actually, in the UK, we have a really proud history of livestock production, and we have a very large number, as you can see, of native breeds, i.e. British, key British, genetically unique breeds that we produced here in the UK over the centuries, mostly since the mid 1700s, in order to exploit sort of unique niches within our ecosystems here in the UK. So, we've got sheep that are specifically bred to eat seaweed on the beaches of some island up in Orkney, because they don't have very much grass up there. And we have livestock which are, uniquely designed to graze upland areas where there is, poor weather and very little grass. So, we've got across, as you can see, that whole spectrum, an awful lot of genetic diversity here in the UK, but many of those breeds are, very rare. We're talking down in the dozens of breeding females left for some of those breeds in the priority category. So, we talk about extinctions of, natural species, but there are also have been in the recent past, and there is risk that it will happen in the near future. Also, extinctions of some of these livestock breeds, which do bring absolutely priceless genetic diversity, and who knows when we might need that genetic diversity in future. And just briefly also on agricultural woodland. So as you can see on the right, and again, this is something which isn't necessarily appreciated. Actually, our level of woodland has doubled across the country in the past 100 years. Obviously, it reached a low point around the time of the Second World War, and since then has actually strongly bounced back. So actually, we have been quite aggressively reforesting in the UK over the last 70 or so years. And of the 3.2 million hectares of woodland in the UK, about 1 million of that is on agricultural land. So farmers essentially are stewards of about a third of the woodland in the UK, the majority of which is in Scotland. But there has been a 50% increase in forestry on farms since 2007, which again is something which is perhaps not generally appreciated, certainly in the media. Now, we obviously have these targets to plant 30,000 hectares of trees a year, which is, that's the target, but we have to appreciate, I guess, where we are. So in 2019-20, we actually planted 13,500 hectares, of which 10,000 hectares was in Scotland, of which 75% was in conifer plantations, essentially commercial conifer plantations. So when we're talking about all of these trees that we need to be planting, especially native broadleaf species, that's not what's happening. We are pretty much nowhere on that. And again, those conifers, well, actually, they might be relatively good for locking up atmospheric carbon, but again, they are there for a commercial reason. That's why they're being planted, and they will eventually, obviously, be harvested and put to use either as biomass or potentially in construction. So these are kind of the facts on the ground at the moment, and this is sort of, again, it's great if we can have an appreciation of where we are right now. So we're talking about AES. Obviously, there's a long history of agri-environment schemes in this country, which I won't go into. But if we look at sort of recent history, as you can see, there on the left-hand side is the amount of land across the 4 nations of the UK in those higher level schemes, the higher targeted agri-environment schemes. And that has steadily increased over time to the current day. But as you can see, on the right-hand side are the more entry-level schemes, so what might be considered to be more analogous with SFI today, potentially mid-tier schemes today. And as you can see, they dropped off a cliff back in 2015 when entry-level scheme was phased out and the current countryside stewardship mid-tier schemes were phased in. And basically farmers took one look at the transition between those two schemes and thought, that's not for me. And I was one of those farmers. From the complexity of it versus ELS, to the administration versus ELS, to the bad stories we heard about payments and the bad stories we heard about the administration and inspections. Farmers basically took one look at the replacement to ELS, and you can see the absolutely vertiginous drop-off in land under agri-environment in that following 5 years. So I kind of bring this graph into the presentation just as a demonstration of what can happen if farmers don't want to engage with a scheme. You know, nothing is going to make them engage with a scheme, and it has to be made attractive, both financially and from a practical engagement point of view, in order for farmers to do so. Otherwise, the danger is we'll have a repeat of those late 2010s where we saw a huge drop-off in enrollment and a lot of, obviously, a lot of gains that were made under agri-environment through the 2000s and early 2010s were obviously lost as that land was lost to agri-environment schemes, and that will, of course, you know, continue to be the risk. So if we look a bit about imports and exports, sort of broad terms, just move myself around there. So as I said, we import around 40% of our food into the UK. Around 70% of those imports come from the European Union, and around 80% of our food exports go to the European Union. So the European Union is by far and away our largest trade partner when it comes to food. And of course, that makes sense. When we are primarily, as you can see, sorry, that's on the next graph, you know, when we're primarily trading fresh foods, then geographical proximity has a huge impact on that. But as you can see, we also have a significant trade deficit in food of about £26 billion. We import a lot more than we export. Our largest trade partners, as you can see, for imports, in the top 5 are all within the European Union, and they're all our near neighbours in the European Union. Our prime export partners, 4 of the 5, are within the European Union and are our nearest neighbours in the European Union. So again, you can just see the impact and the prominence of the EU within those figures. What are we importing? We're importing fruit, wine, veg, cheese, and beef. So we're importing primarily unprocessed fresh food. What are we exporting? Well, we're exporting whiskey. Frankly, that's pretty much what we export. So as you can see, that is more whiskey by value than the next 4 categories put together. And you know, again, from that, you know, whiskey and salmon, so that's basically Scotland. So Scotland is basically driving UK's food exports. So you can see the huge disparity in both the values of and also the volumes and the types of food that we're importing, and the processed, primarily the processed foods that we are exporting. So certification schemes. Hopefully you'll be, you know, vaguely you'll recognize most of these schemes, although history would probably dictate that you might not. So you know, essentially most of these certification schemes, they, you know, they'll try to achieve one of 2 things: higher welfare, greater provenance, potentially, you know, better environmental management. That's what these schemes are trying to achieve. So, you know, for example, but they're generally a reaction to some event, so to usually a food crisis, and they're an attempt by the industry to reassure consumers as to what's happened. So, for example, British Lion Egg Mark, that's from the late 90s, and that basically says that all eggs stamped with the British Lion Egg Mark are vaccinated. All the chickens have been vaccinated for salmonella, for example. So that was obviously a kickback from the salmonella crisis of the mid-1990s. Red Tractor, which is the one, oh, there it is, Red Tractor, which is the one which will probably be perhaps most familiar. You know, that is around traceability and high production standards. And again, that was a kickback from the BSE crisis of the late 1990s, when traceability was a real concern around UK meat trade. So Red Tractor sort of originated in that area. If we look at leaf mark certification, goes back to 2002, and that's primarily around environmental stewardship and improved, you know, biodiversity and habitat creation, etc., on farms. And that was how that started. So different certification schemes have different initial drivers. Now, some of them get bigger over time and take in more factors, but you know, that's sort of the range of different things we're looking at when we're looking at certification schemes. But you know, many of these, frankly, you know, consumers, RSPCA, that's primarily around animal welfare, for example. But you know, many of these farmers don't or consumers don't necessarily tend to recognize, or you know, they look at Red Tractor and they kind of recognize it, but they don't really know what it means. They just think it kind of means quality and British. Now, the interesting thing around the Union Jack, which many people will see on that Red Tractor logo, is that the Union Jack is meaningless. You know, two sugars here side by side. Now, I would normally ask at this point, what's the difference between these two sugars? The sugar on the left and the sugar on the right, they are both, they've got the Union Jack on. The sugar on the right's even got a Royal Warrant on. However, the sugar on the right is made from imported cane sugar from tropical countries, and it's just processed by Tate and Lyle, which is an American-owned company on the banks of the Thames in a big processing facility. On the left is British-grown silver spoon sugar, and that's made from sugar beet, which is grown primarily in the East Anglia and the Fens and Cambridgeshire. So both of them have the Union Jack on. If you turn them over, and I don't know why it's not on the front, but it's not. If you turn them over, Silver Spoon will have Red Tractor on the back. Of course, Tate and Lyle won't have the Red Tractor on the back. But, you know, looking at those two products side by side, you know, even on the right-hand side, made in the UK. Yeah, made in the UK, but not grown in the UK, as it says on the Silver Spoon on the left. But again, you know, most people in Britain are not aware that we even produce our own sugar from sugar beet in the UK. So, you know, the Union Jack as a means of differentiating between country of origin, etc., is frankly pretty meaningless. Which again is why, you know, Red Tractor in terms of provenance and traceability, you know, Red Tractor means it has been grown or bred and processed in the UK. And today, for farmers, that's kind of the main thing that that really Red Tractor means to us. And then if we're just looking at representative organizations briefly, you know, again, some of these, hopefully most of these will be familiar. You know, NFU, National Farmers Union, LEAF is sort of an umbrella body. Well, no, LEAF is an organization which is trying to drive greater environmental sustainability through the food supply chain. You know, OF&G is an organic certification body. The GWCT, again, Wildlife Conservation Trust, which is my organization. You know, again, that is around you know, conserving wildlife within the countryside. But the Allerton Project, where I work, is all about farming and food sustainability. You know, the National Sheep Association, the National Pig Association, the National Beef Association. We love a three-letter acronym. But there's a lot of bodies out there, and this is just a representative sample. There's a lot of bodies out there lobbying for the interests of you know, of their members. AHDB, of course, is a sort of a government quango type thing, which is there to help farmers do, you know, research and development and marketing. So there's a lot of different organizations out there that represent different elements of the market. Of course, the NFU represents tenants, but the Tenant Farmers Association specifically represents tenants and only represents tenants. So yeah, there's a lot of crossover here as well. But yeah, hopefully, you know, these organizations you are sort of broadly familiar with. Rural crime's a big issue. So as a farmer, I have experienced extortion, arson, theft, burglary, criminal damage, livestock worrying, fly tipping, night hawking. That's where people come with metal detectors at night and try and find treasure, and then if you confront them, they can get quite violent. Hair coursing, again, they can get very violent if you confront them. And they're just the major things that I've had to deal with as a farmer, and I'm only in my, you know, mid 30s. And then you've just got general trespassing, threatening behavior. You know, farmers feel uniquely vulnerable. We are the target of a lot of crime, and we're a long way from the nearest police station. We're a long way from the nearest help. You know, we have, you know, big farms with extensive yards, sheds, straw stacks, livestock sheds, barbed wire fences that can be cut. You know, lots of things that can be done to farmers. So again, you know, I have experienced a lot of rural crime in my short career. And as you can see in 2021, and these are statistics from NFU Mutual, there was more than £40 million just in rural theft in 2021. 70% of sheep farmers have experienced dog attacks on their livestock, costing nearly £2 million in 2021. Nearly £2 million of destroyed livestock just from dog attacks in 2021. And more than 15,000 sheep are killed by dogs in the countryside every year. Now, that is, I mean, it blows your mind, doesn't it, to think that 15,000 sheep are attacked and killed by dogs in the countryside every year. And that's just sheep worrying. You know, the worst recorded attack I've heard of in that vein is almost 70 sheep and 70 lambs and 20 sheep killed in a single attack. you know, 90 odd animals killed in a single attack. It's absolutely you know, it's horrific. But as you can see, there's a lot of other things which are also happening in the countryside, and this is just theft. Again, this isn't counting the extortion. This isn't counting the arson, which is a very big problem in agriculture as well. So, you know, rural crime is a real issue, and of course, you know, police forces operating under, you know, very tight budgets, and the electorate being mostly in the towns and cities, you know, farmers often feel very exposed and very left out. Health and safety is just you know, agriculture has not got a good record in health and safety. So as you can see there, agriculture has a worker fatality rate 21 times higher than the all industry average in the UK. As a farmer, you are 21 times more likely to be killed at work than working in the rest of the economy. And you can see that, yes, the number of fatal injuries to workers over a 40-year period has dropped, which is good, but it's not dropped sort of that far. And of course, a lot less people work in agriculture now than they did 40 years ago. So again, those statistics on the left-hand side, they're kind of flatter to deceive. And again, you look at the comparison between agriculture and construction, which is the next most dangerous industry. You know, so we are not doing well in agriculture, and this has many reasons. You know, lone working, decrepit infrastructure, which was designed for more people to operate, a laissez-faire approach by many farmers to health and safety, especially if they're on their own farm and they're not an employee, they don't have any employees. So, you know, but this is a huge problem. But on average, 32 people per year are killed on farms across the UK. And of course, we're the only workplace where children are still being killed on a regular basis on farms. Children often are using farms as, you know, playgrounds. They're encouraged to go on machinery. They're encouraged to actually work on the farms at a very young age. So we still have children being killed on farms. But the top causes of deaths, and there have been for a very long time, are moving vehicles, killed by animals, and struck by objects. They are the sort of the main three reasons why farmers are killed on farm. So this is just a continuing stain on the agricultural sector that these statistics really fail to get any better year on year. There's a huge increase in demand for charity support from farmers. There, especially mental health support, financial support. Essentially, this has been declining. You know, farm mental health and survey after survey has demonstrated this is deteriorating, especially in the last 6-7 years, with the huge number of pressures which are on the agricultural sector, and especially as we go through the agricultural transition period. So this selection, and again, this is only a selection of agricultural charities, are overwhelmed with demand at the moment, and yeah, it's a huge problem. Of course, most of these things are driven at some level by finance. There's also a lot of other things that go on within the bubbles of farms, which can cause mental health problems, of course. But yeah, farmers, lone working, long hours, small returns. This can be and the number of things which can sort of impact on farm businesses is absolutely huge. But it's worth noting that as far ago as 2010, 25% of farming households lived below the official government poverty line. So 1 in 4 farming households are below that £20,000 household income poverty line. And that was 13 years ago. And the financial situation for the most part of agriculture has only deteriorated in that time. Average English farm business income in 2021, which was, of course, the first year of the reduction in BPS. So as you can see, if we're talking about what percentage of the average English farm's income comes from BPS, from direct payments, those subsidy payments which are being phased out under the agricultural transition plan, 53%. Actually, if you'd taken this survey from the year before, it would have been 62%. Before those payments started to be reduced. So a huge proportion of the average English farm's income comes from those, or came from those direct support payments. But as you can see, that massively varied between different sectors. So things like horticulture and horticulture and oh God, I'm struggling to find where it's not significant. Well, horticulture, it was fairly small. Poultry as well, relatively small. Poultry is conducted on a very small footprint. So generally speaking, again, as with horticulture, is generally quite a small footprint. As with pigs, is generally quite a small footprint. So traditionally, they've had a relatively low proportion of their income coming from direct payments, and a much larger proportion on those higher value items coming from the actual agricultural production. But then if you look at things like less favored area grazing livestock, lowland grazing livestock, actually their agricultural income on average is negative. So they are losing money on the food that they are producing. And that is where, the vast majority of their income is coming from agri-environment schemes, direct payments, and diversification, if not their entire income coming from those sources. And again, the average mixed farm, so that's really, if we're talking about the average English farm, we're probably talking about the mixed farm. Again, on average, they are losing money on their agricultural operations, and they are only being kept in the green by direct payments, diversifications, and agri-environment payments. So that's the situation, or that was the situation a couple of years ago. Larger farms are generally less reliant on BPS, and so it's those smaller farms which are more reliant on that. So yeah, in 2015-16, so these figures are taken from Health and Harmony. So obviously, which was released in 2017, 2018. Only the top 25% of farms actually made a profit from agriculture in England. The bottom 25% of farms actually made a loss of £32,000 from agricultural activities, and they made an overall loss even with all those other income streams combined. And then the middle 50% of farms made losses on agriculture, but did make a profit overall due to those other income streams. So, that's quite stark when you look at it, that is the situation that English British agriculture was in, just before the agricultural transition period started. Okay. So yeah, as I mentioned, larger farm businesses obviously have a larger income, but also, yes, those larger farm businesses have a relatively smaller proportion of their income coming from those direct payments, which, as you can see, increases as you head down the farm size scale. So I guess what you can see here is the smaller the farm, the less profitable its agricultural activities are, and the more it relies on that other money as income. So especially when you get to those very small farms, again, those direct payments historically, which are now being phased out, they were essentially keeping those smaller farms afloat. So again, there's the concern that as we go forward, and I don't think it's an intentional policy, but what we are, as what farmers are concerned about, is that we will actually see a consolidation of the agricultural sector. We'll see less farms. We'll see just bigger farming units, bigger farming companies swallowing up the smaller farms in order to make those economies of scale work. So that is a concern. And as we saw earlier on, 75% of the average tenant's income came from those BPS payments. So if you're a small tenant farmer on an extensive lowland or upland grazing situation, which of course those guys are geographically concentrated in places like the northwest, the northeast, then you are in particular problems, based on the figures that I'm demonstrating here, which again, these are sort of, these are DEFRA figures. So if we look at the situation where we are now, with the recent huge volatility in input and commodity costs. So between September 2021 to September 2022, there was a 34% input cost inflation of farm inputs for the average English farm. And that was following on the heels of 22% inflation over the same period the year before. So you're looking at a compound inflation there of about, 55% inflation over 2 years. And that just takes us up to September 2022. Fertilizer increased by an average of 134%, fuel by 43%, and those other things, as you can see there. But food price inflation only went up to around 13%. And you know, it was around that figure, wasn't it, for a while. So the cost of inputs massively increased. Whereas in many cases, the cost that farmers were being paid did not increase or only increased a small amount. So as you can see here, we've got agflation mapped up against the CPI for the wider economy and the CPI for food. And as you can see, agflation massively outstripped those other inflationary elements. So what farmers were being, you know, what it was costing us to produce the food, the inflation on that was far higher than the inflation in the wider economy, as you can see there on nitrogen fertilizer, as you can see there on diesel as well. So there were some absolutely massive pressures which are still with us today. And again, we're in mid 2023 right now, massive financial pressures on food producers at the moment. And this has led to some situations. For example, you know, there are apple growers in Kent who are ripping out apple orchards because they need a 20% increase in what they're being paid for their apples by the supermarkets just to break even. And the supermarkets, for example, there was a famous example which was doing the rounds in the media a few months ago. Supermarkets offered them 0.8%, which was less than 1/20th of what they needed in order to continue in business. So things like apple orchards were already only around 14-15% self-sufficient in fruit. We are losing productive capacity in sectors like horticulture because, unfortunately, you know, producers are just not being paid what they need to be paid to stay in business. You know, we're producing 1 billion less eggs in January 2023 than we were in January 2022, again, for that same reason. And of course, what you saw was egg shortages in supermarkets and then eggs being brought in from abroad from production systems with lower, for example, welfare requirements than we have in the UK. So battery caged eggs being brought in from places like Italy to replace free range eggs being produced in the UK. So these are the sorts of things that we have been seeing in the food market in you know, in recent months, which are, you know, having a significant impact. So if we talk about volatility, which is really important for farmers, you know, why do we get such massive volatility in agricultural markets? So currency fluctuations have traditionally been a big element of it, in large part because CAP payments, the BPS payments, were denominated in euros. Now let me just get this right. So I always get it the wrong way around. So a weak pound is good for exports and for BPS because the euro is worth more as it comes in. But it's also bad for imports of inputs. So yeah, so although your BPS might be worth more, of course, generally speaking, your fertilizer, for example, which is bought in from Europe, will also cost you more. So these things do tend to balance out. But yeah, currency fluctuations have always been an important element. Weather, of course, you know, was it 3 years ago when we had an absolutely catastrophic harvest in this country and wheat production, for example, fell by 40%. You know, that has an impact on the wheat price, especially when that's coupled with global fluctuations to the same extent. Disease, you know, things like foot and mouth, things like avian influenza, these have a massive impact on domestic production and prices and costs. External global shocks, so again, climate change, geopolitical things like the war in Ukraine, and then domestic shocks. So yeah, things like Brexit have a massive impact on volatility. So that's why we see volatility, for example, you know, if we look at 2021 versus 2022 for your average pig farm, income dropped from 48,000 to 13,000, poultry from 78,000 to 38,000. You know, these are big shifts that we are seeing. Milk prices went as high as 50 pence per litre, for example, back in the back end of 2022. But today they're around 35 pence per litre. So they've dropped by 15 pence per litre over that sort of 6-month period, which is now below the cost of production. So that's why we've seen 5% of dairy farmers leave the industry in the last 12 months, because, you know, again, farmers are price takers and they really have very little negotiating power when it comes to what they're paid. So if a processor supermarket says we're going to pay you less than it costs you to produce, there's really very, very little that you can actually do about that. And we see that time and again. And it's why we've lost 3/4, for example, of UK dairy farmers in the past 30 years. You know, I used to be a dairy farmer. We went out of it in 2006 because we've been losing £75,000 for about 3 or 4 years. So, you know, this is nothing new, but it's getting worse. You know, the level of volatility due to climate change, due to geopolitical instability, due to domestic political instability is worse. And of course, then uncertainty around domestic agricultural policy and payment rates and all that sort of thing. Yeah, the CAP was at least a constant ever since 1972, 73. And of course, that is now, you know, no longer the case. And again, just when we're talking about volatility, you know, here we are looking at our yields at the Allerton project for the last decade. And again, you can see how massively volatile they are from year to year. Just looking at winter wheat on the left-hand side there, you know, in 2012, 5 tons to the hectare, and a couple of years later, we were up around 9-10 tons to the hectare as an average, and that will be due to weather events which impact our yields. But if you look then at 2020, we didn't even plant any winter wheat for harvest 2020 because the winter of 2019 was so wet, we didn't get any of our winter wheat planted. So our main cash crop that year, winter wheat is generally considered to be the main cash crop on an arable farm. We didn't have any because we just couldn't get it planted because of the volatility. And that's why you could see we had a lot of spring wheat that year. And spring wheat, generally speaking, you know, is not as productive, is not as profitable as winter wheat. So you can see the impact of just what weather is doing for volatility there. And again, this is a farm profitability at the Allerton project over that period of time. And you can see the massive volatility as a result of all of those factors we've discussed. And the general underlying reduction in farm profitability, frankly, certainly since the 2010s. You know, agriculture was, frankly, a bit of a license to print money between, you know, the end of the Second World War and the mid 1990s, between government support and strong commodity prices and low costs. You know, agriculture was a profitable business, and of course, there's nothing wrong with it being profitable. But since the mid 1990s, for the most part, agriculture has not been a profitable business. You know, many farms will have more years where they lose money than where they make money. And this, you know, this is, I guess it can't continue indefinitely. And I guess as well, you know, as a bit of context, around 50% of farmers actually voted to leave the European Union, the same level of farmers who, you know, within society more generally, who voted to leave the European Union. And, you know, there was many different reasons why farmers specifically might have voted to have left, but many of them felt, well, you know, things have been terrible for about the last 25 years, then perhaps things will be better, you know, if we make a big change. So, you know, that's some of the thinking perhaps behind that. So just looking at the trends in agricultural commodity prices, in this case since the 1970s, which are quite illustrative. On the right-hand side, if we start there, you can see if we adjust for inflation, wheat prices from the early 1970s to 2018 in this case, the actual value of what farmers were producing, of what arable farmers are producing, declined from in the region of, you know, £500 per tonne to around £150 per tonne, adjusted for inflation. So if you are an arable farmer and you are primarily producing wheat over that period of time, then the value of what you're producing has declined by 3 times in that period of time. Now, imagine any other industry where you just accept that your profitability, your income has gone down by 2/3. It's not even managed to hold steady with inflation. It's actually decreased by 2/3. But that is reflected across all agricultural commodity types. So if you look at milk, for example, milk in 1970, you know, made an average equivalent of 4 pence per litre. Today it's 29 pence per litre. That's not adjusted for inflation. But if you look at what it would buy you, you know, back in 1970, a litre of milk, you know, 370 litres of milk would buy you a labourer for a week. Today, or back in 2020, it was more than 1,100 litres. You know, 33,500 litres would buy you a tractor back in 1970. It would cost you 230,000 litres in 2020 to buy the same tractor. So you see how the value of what farmers have been producing has been declining since the 1970s. The only thing that you could buy more of between those two dates is, of course, wheat, because wheat itself has become a lot cheaper, but that's just another agricultural commodity. So yeah, the value of agricultural produce has declined in that time, at the same time as all the costs have increased. You know, pesticide costs, machinery costs, land costs, labor costs, rental costs. These have all massively increased over that period of time as well. Now, if we look at sort of where the profit is, and sorry, just to return to that previous point, for example, a fleece from a sheep in 1970 would be worth around £2. Adjust that for inflation today, and you'd be talking around £20. So a fleece today should be worth, just to have kept pace with 1970s prices, should be worth around £20 today. It's worth £1. So it's worth 1/20th. A sheep's fleece is worth 1/20th of what it was worth in the 1970s. And that's just absolutely crazy, which is why we're seeing, you know, instead of wool being the bedrock of our economy like it was, you know, 200, 300 years ago, you know, wool is now essentially being burned or composted on farms because it costs more to take the fleece off the sheep, which you have to do for welfare reasons, than it does, you know, it's not worth transporting it then to the market, because that will just lose you more money. So that's the kind of crazy situation that we're working with some agricultural commodities today. Now, if we look at where the actual profit is within the agricultural supply chain, it's considered that around about 6% of the value of the agri-food supply chain goes back to farmers' pockets. So the other 94% ends up with the retailers, with the processors, with the transporters. So even though farmers are producing, you know, 60% of the food that we produce, that we eat in this country, we're only taking home around 6% of the value of that food. And if you see some of these examples here, so if you say the average loaf of bread in the middle there, the average loaf of bread is £1.14, and this is from a Sustain report which came out a couple of years ago. The profit within that £1.14 loaf of bread is about 4.35p once all the costs in the supply chain have been paid for. As you can see, the farmer is only getting 0.09 pence of that, the value of that loaf. So the baker, the retailer, the miller, they're all taking you know, their respective shares of the profit, and it's the farmer who's left with literally the crumbs. And you can see that across all those other elements as well. So, you know, within cheese, a £2.50 block of cheese, the profit within that is only around 3.5 pence, but of which the farmer only takes a 0.05 pence. So essentially the farmer who is, you know, if we take wheat for an example, or beef, in the beef burgers, you know, that beef animal might be on your farm for 3 years. And then it goes off and is slaughtered and ends up in a supermarket within 2 weeks. So for 3 years and all of the input costs that you put into that, you end up with 0.1 pence profit versus 7 pence for the retailer, who essentially just put it on a shelf and sell it. So that's, again, it's the imbalance within the food supply chain and where the profits are within the food supply chain. So something which is often sort of stated is that we don't necessarily have to have consumers pay more for food to make it more economically and environmentally sustainable. We just need to see more of the profits from the wider supply chain passed down to the farmer rather than retained by the retailers, by the processors, etc. And food spend. So we're just coming towards the end now. Food spend. So this kind of paints a picture as well. So actually in the UK, even with recent food price inflation, we still have the 3rd cheapest food in the world per capita. So just behind the United States and Singapore, the UK is then the 3rd cheapest food essentially in the world. And that has fallen from around 30%. So around 8% of the average household expenditure is spent on in-home eating, excluding alcohol. And that's fallen from around 30% in the 1950s. So, you know, what that demonstrates is that the food supply chain in the UK has become incredibly efficient, incredibly productive in that time. You know, farm productivity has massively increased in that time. And of course, then the efficiencies within our sort of full, you know, farm to fork food supply chain have massively increased. But, you know, essentially, again, what that demonstrates is that we talk about food poverty, and quite rightly so. But in reality, kind of from my perspective, there's almost no such thing as food poverty. There's just poverty. And the money which people are no longer spending on food, they're instead having to spend on rent, on transport, on energy bills. But food is the one thing people feel they have some control over. It's the one thing that they're paying out every single week or several times a week, and they notice when it fluctuates. So actually the recent food price inflations we've been seeing in England and in the UK, although obviously hugely unwelcome, especially to people on low incomes, they're really not getting anywhere near to sort of, if you like, combating the huge food price deflation that we've seen for the last 50, 60 years. But of course, again, it's the huge increases in those other parts of general household expenditure, which are really then making people, making people feel scared when they see food price inflation doing what it's doing. But in reality, yeah, in the UK, we've managed to somehow defy gravity in producing very high welfare, very high environmentally sustainable food, whilst continually managing to decrease the cost of that food. And of course, in large part, that's come from reducing the amount of that money within the food supply chain, which ends up back at the farm gate, which has had implications for reinvestment in farm and for, as I said, 1 in 4 farmers, even 10, 12 years ago, were living below the poverty line. So sort of that's the reality of where we are. So that's a real whistle-stop tour. I think that's just gone over an hour and a half. A real whistle-stop tour of sort of the basic structure of where we are with sort of the agriculture within the economy of the UK. So there are going to be 2 more recorded webinars, one each consisting of 4 different sectors of the UK agricultural sector, to really get more into the actual farming element of it, rather than the kind of the facts and figures of where it sits within the economy. And also then hopefully, again, I will see many of you at the Allerton Project for 2 days worth of talking more in depth about food and farming specifically. So thank you for listening. I hope that's been interesting. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you again or meeting you at the Allerton Project or elsewhere. Thank you very much. And I will now stop sharing that and stop the recording. Thank you very much.